Aloha, everyone, and welcome to the Empowered Hour. Today, I am super excited because I have a guest who is the Executive Director of Impact Boston, Meg Stone. How are you?
I'm great. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, and just if you can share with the audience a bit about your background and the work that you're doing over in Boston, we'd love to hear.
Sure. So I actually came to empowerment self-defense through domestic violence and sexual assault advocacy. I was going to court with survivors who were getting restraining orders against their abusive partners. I worked nights in a shelter, and I knew that I was incredibly dedicated to that work. But I also knew that I wanted to do something that was more focused on prevention. And I didn't really know what that was. I knew that the emergency support work was incredibly needed. I have infinite respect and admiration for people who have the capacity to do that type of work. And I wanted to see what else was out there. So I started a degree program in public health, and through that, I found impact. And self-defense is not the most obvious public health solution because people think of public health on a more global or, community level. But I really saw that the tools that people learned from impact had a ripple effect in their communities and gave them the capacity to both protect and advocate for themselves, but also to speak up in the kind of ways that change the norms, the practices, the unquestioned assumptions in communities that make it harder for people to find healthy relationships or to get the support they need when they're experiencing abuse.
Yeah. Wow. It sounds like you've been on a journey. How long have you been doing this?
I took my first impact class 20 years ago. And, to say that it's life-changing is very cliche because that's what we all say. But I really did. It was the experience of using my body to protect and advocate for myself that really made me internalize everything that I'd always believed. I'd always believed that it was my choice whether or not someone touched me. I always believed that I had the right to say no, to have my own boundaries. But there was a way that that belief kind of lived outside of my body. And as soon as I got the experience of advocating for myself, and, I, last kid picked in gym class, could actually hit hard and knock over a large man multiple times over and over again, even though he was harassing me and threatening me. There was something about that lived visceral experience that made me believe what I believed so much deeper and in such a more, I'm just going to say, in such a deeper way.
Yeah. Wow. So many times, when we are inspired to do this work, there's something that has happened in our lives, someone who specifically inspired us to do this work, or something that happened in our personal lives. Is there something that you would be willing to share that makes you feel that that was a moment in your life that brought you down this path?
So I haven't thought about this in years, but it's what I thought of when you asked that question. So I have a friend named Julie Nelson, and I met Julie, 22 or 3 years ago. And at the time I was first friends with Julie, she was a volunteer for Impact. And she loved impact with an enthusiasm that I didn't love anything with. Like, she was so, not only was she passionate about it, not only did she believe in it, but we were young single people in our 20s, and we went to clubs and we went to events and we did things. And in so many of our interactions, whatever they were, it was relevant to impact and it was relevant to self-defense for her. There was a way that she was assessing situations. There was a way that she was communicating boundaries and evaluating what the other person did. And there was just a way that she lived it and internalized it that really inspired my curiosity. And so at one point, she took me to an Impact graduation. And for folks not familiar with Impact, graduation is sort of the last day of class. There's a portion of the class where the students can invite their friends and loved ones, and the organization kind of invites people from the public to come and watch them practice realistic self-defense scenarios where the padded assailant will actually attack them physically or verbally, and they'll actually get to fight back in front of people. And so I, at the time was doing a different nonprofit job because I got too burned out of domestic violence crisis work. And I saw all of these young women, most of whom were teens or in their 20s, just fierce and powerful. And I was like so moved and so overwhelmed that like, not only did I run out of the room, but I ran out of the building. And I distinctly remember it was in the basement of a YWCA in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I ran up the stairs, I ran out the front door, and I started like walking laps around the block. And like the energy that I felt inside me was so much that I needed to just move. Otherwise, there was no way that I was going to, there was no way that I was going to be able to settle. And as I was walking around the block, I kept saying to myself, this is what I'm going to do with my life. This is what I'm going to do with my life. This is what I'm going to do with my life. Okay, now it's time to go back in. And eventually I did. And eventually I watched the rest of the graduation. The more I thought about what I had seen in that graduation, the more it became relevant to all of the areas of violence prevention and public health that I cared about. There was research that showed that women with histories of abuse were disproportionately represented among women who had sexually transmitted infections or HIV. There was evidence that women with histories of abuse had more medical diagnoses, poorer health, several types of conditions that, in the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, people who experienced abuse in childhood have poorer health by almost every measure of health. So it really showed me that there was this very necessary link between sort of our lived experiences of our bodies and our histories. Yeah. And so I started working while I was in graduate school at creating an impact program that addressed survivors in terms of healthy sexuality and negotiating in sexual relationships. And the more that I got involved in that work, the more I was like, you know what? I didn't just write a paper and move on with my life. I want to actually do this. So the program that I developed in grad school is now part of Impact. It's a program called Take Your Power, paused by the pandemic, but hopefully not for too long, that really sort of integrates the embodied experience of self-defense with sort of all of the other changes that result in healthy relationships and healthy sexuality. But I also very quickly realized that thinking about sexual violence or intimate partner violence as a public health issue, we couldn't just think about the people who were experiencing abuse and the people who were abusing. And so as the field really moved toward bystander intervention or really working with communities to change the conditions in which sexual assault and intimate partner violence were possible, there was a role for impact and there was a role for empowerment self-defense. A lot of the types of challenging conversations that change the course of how possible abuse is in a community are conversations that are stressful and fear-inducing. So if I'm a teacher and I see another teacher put their hand on a student's knee, or if I work in a disability service agency and I see somebody hugging a person with a disability without their choice or without their consent, I'm in a position to make it known that that behavior is a concern.
Yeah.
And if I am overwhelmed by my own stress response, my own fear response, the chances of me doing that are pretty minimal. So what we started doing with Impact, probably like 15 years ago or something, is we started practicing those types of conversations. So instead of, just somebody yelling and harassing hate speech at you on the street, our instructors would portray, a coworker who was being challenged on a line crossing, who would become defensive, who would become insulting and disrespectful. So the student would practice staying calm, staying focused, bringing the problem back to the substance of the issue, and manage all of that adrenaline, because yes, there is violence in the workplace. So there are people who are assaulted in their workplace, but there's also people who are fearful that saying something that another person doesn't want to hear or another person might be threatened by could result in harm to them. So what I like to say is people who can protect themselves are better able to speak up in their communities. So that is, that's the work that I'm most excited about right now, is sort of using this skill set, this sort of deep embodied feeling of being powerful, even when you're scared, to change the norms and the inaction and the silence in which abuse and violence thrive.
Awesome. Yeah, I know that definitely from my personal experience, dealing with high adrenaline, high stress scenarios, it's been really great to have these trainings, just because it has been a game changer for me to be able to think through everything, check in with myself, look at my surroundings, be aware of my surroundings, and really be able to act when so many times a lot of people, when they are dealing with that kind of stress, they just freeze. So I think that it's really great that you're doing that work. I know that so many times when we think about who inspires us, there are different people who really stand out in our lives, who are our cheerleaders, who are support, but are also our inspiration. And I just wanted to ask you, who's your hero in your life?
Gosh. It's really sad that I can't answer this question easily. It's not that I didn't think about it. I
know you know a lot of amazing women. So
yeah. Okay. So here's my answer. So I have the incredible honor of getting to work with Turtle Mountain Empowerment Self-Defense on their journey to becoming an impact organization. So the founder of that organization is Shanda Quatra, and she took an impact class in 2005 for no other reason than because she needed a gym credit, and it was a 3-day class and she could finish her gym credit and move on toward the rest of her college degree. But coming out of that class, she knew that she needed to bring impact to the reservation. And the reservation is about 3.5 hours away from the university. It was not possible to get more than a couple of her friends to come down and take the impact class. And what's more is the Turtle Mountain community needed an impact program that was culturally specific, that was tailored both to the unique realities of Indigenous women and girls, and also not only culturally relevant, but also different communities of people have different experiences of violence. Where I live, among my community, abduction is rare. For Indigenous women, abduction is not rare. So we can't just pick up an ESD program that works in a city and like plop it down in a rural area. You know, we can't take an ESD program from a white community and plop it down in an Indigenous community. So I think what, you know, and not just Shanda, but the whole Turtle Mountain team, which is Angie Dakota, James Dakota, Mike Davis, and several others who are in the pipeline. And all of them do what I do, except on top of full-time jobs and parenting. And in a community where there is constant trauma and violence and, you know, crisis and emergency situations having to do with abuse and violence do cross my personal life, but it's not constant the way that it is in a lot of communities. So I'm just incredibly grateful for the opportunity to support the development of impact for Indigenous communities led by members of Indigenous communities. And I long for the day where I and all of the rest of the staff of Impact Boston are completely irrelevant and unneeded, and they're training us instead of the other way around. So it just, you know, every time we go to the reservation and every time we teach, I just have this moment of gratitude that I get to be part of supporting the leadership of people who should have been in leadership for the last 40 years, you know, and being a part of changing the culture of ESD, the makeup of the leadership of ESD, and in the process, reaching women, girls, trans people, non-binary people, and people with disabilities on the reservation who are urgently needing these skills.
Yeah. Well, I think you actually touched on the next question. It was, you know, what is something important you want people to know about your work? And I think that it is really important to know that it is something that you can utilize for different cultures, for different genders, and for different racial backgrounds. What other pieces of information?
Yeah, and I think it's really important, particularly for those of us who are not part of communities that are most affected by abuse and violence, to really sort of come in with humility and come in with the intention of uplifting other people's leadership, because there are just so many inequities that impact, you know, why I run a nonprofit and someone else doesn't. And so I think in the world of empowerment self-defense, it is so important to inform everything we do with work to shift and upend those inequities. You know, there are very few, if any, stories of middle-class, white, cisgender, heterosexual women who physically defend themselves and then are charged with crimes. But looking at the work of Miriam Kaba, looking at the work of so many others, that is a common experience for Black women, other women of color, LGBTQ plus people of color. So access to the ability to protect your body is not equally distributed in this society. And so I think we really need to see empowerment self-defense as a way of equipping people with practical, usable skills to change the inequities and the harms that are rampant in our culture.
I agree. I was just thinking, so you had mentioned before that you had a program that's working right now, but hopefully it won't be relevant after the pandemic. What are some programs or projects that you're working on right now that you would like to share?
Sure. So one of the biggest things that I'm most excited about is an initiative in the New England theater and performing arts community called Line Drawn. Line Drawn is basically the whole performing arts sector coming together to create shared abuse prevention practices that will eventually become the norm of how theater and performing arts is practiced in our community. So everything from ensuring that actors have private places to change so that people aren't, walking through the dressing room anytime they want, to sexual harassment policies, to bystander intervention training, to diversity, equity, and inclusion practices, to making sure that intimate or sexual scenes on stage are choreographed by people who are trained and trauma informed and can ensure that actors are consenting to any type of touch that they are using throughout the role, and ensuring that folks in the performing arts community have the tools to be able to intervene if an unsafe or abusive situation occurs in their show. We did a survey of theater practitioners, and we found these, pretty heartbreaking stories. One that I can think of, for example, there was a kissing scene, and the actor who related the story had a scene partner who would inappropriately turn a stage kiss into an intimate kiss. And she was very upset by this. It took her out of the moment of the scene. And because she was on stage at the time, she had to kind of stay in the moment and stay in the character, because the character at the time wanted that kiss and she had to go on with the scene. And she reported that to her director and the artistic director. And both of them really cared, really wanted to do something, but just felt like there was nothing they could do, because if they fired this person, they would have to cancel the show. Wow. And what we want is for there to be clear expectations and clear accountability around not following the intimacy choreography. Theater is not a job like any other job. So the more expectations and the more sort of strength of those expectations there are, I think the harder it will be for somebody to cross that line. And then for theater organizations to have very clear recourse in situations where somebody, continues to cause harm, continues to cross that line. So what I love about the Line Drawn initiative is because it's all the skills that we would teach in something that would typically be understood as a self-defense class. But there's this connection between what I can do for myself in an unsafe moment to creating broad culture change that involves multiple people. And the connection between those sort of systemic or community level changes and the individual transformation that comes from finding the power in your body is what I'm most excited about. I really believe that so much of the harm of abuse and the inaction around abuse comes from otherwise decent people having some sort of barrier to doing the right thing. There is one Larry Nassar. There are hundreds of people who enabled him.
Yeah.
And we understand him as a monster, which, sounds, I'm not going to dispute that characterization, certainly. But what we need to understand more is how that many people together disregarded the gymnasts, ignored their own policies, ignored state, federal, local laws, lied to survivors, re-traumatized them, expected them to perform at elite levels. And, that's one example. There's lots of not famous people that are in similar situations. And there are so many barriers to people speaking out, many of which I've personally been derailed by several barriers. But I think there's a role that what we teach plays in helping people build their capacity to maintain their poise and their power, even when they are faced with threats, intimidation, gaslighting, anything else that might be coming at them.
Yeah. And I'm happy you brought this up, because it does actually lead into the next question of just, if you had some advice for your younger self, or you had some advice for a young girl who is watching this, who is just soul searching, what is some advice that you could give to them?
I think I'm thinking of my younger self, who was working nights in a shelter, going home and sleeping for an hour, and then waking up and working days in a domestic violence legal advocacy organization, and just I was exhausted constantly. And I think what I would say is, thank you for doing all that you did for all the people that really needed it. And I also would say to other people that you don't have to drive yourself into the ground in order to help other people.
Yeah.
And it is much more, I burned out, I worked at the shelter for 2 years. I've worked at Impact Boston for almost 20. So I think there's a real wisdom in thinking about yourself as someone with finite capacity, and sort of choosing very carefully how to use that capacity.
Very true. Meg, how can people find you if they are in your area, or if they're not in your area and they really love this? How can they get a hold of you?
Yeah, and we travel, and we are still doing virtual classes. So we've had people take our virtual classes from parts of the world that we've never had students from before. So the best way to find Impact is impactboston.org. You can find me on Twitter at Meg Stone Impact.
Okay.
And Impact Boston on Twitter as impact_BOS. And then Facebook, Instagram, though I will confess that I am not on Instagram and have never been on Impact Boston's Instagram, except when people forward me the posts. But our amazing staff does a really good job. And yeah, that's the best way to find us.
Awesome. Well, Meg, thank you so much for coming on and taking this time with me. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks for having me. Take care.
Aloha. And